You are at a dinner party, and someone you've just met asks how you and your wife met. You tell the story. They smile the way people smile at a story they've decided is charming before they've heard it. And somewhere under the smile, you can see the small recalculation happening, the quiet sorting of you into a category, a headline, a symbol of something. You just wanted to tell them about a coffee shop in 2019. Instead, you've become a position they hold. That's the thing nobody warns you about. You didn't marry a woman and gain a wife. You married a woman and gained an audience. The love is the easy part. It's everyone else's relationship to your love that turns out to be the full-time job. So this is what it's actually like. Not the wedding photos, not the rainbow flag in the front yard, but the inside of it. The part that looks like any other marriage and feels like a country with its own weather. 1. The easy part was the wedding. You move fast, everyone jokes about it, and the joke is true. There's an old line about lesbians bringing a U-Haul to the second date, and you laughed at it right up until you found yourself signing a lease 11 weeks after meeting someone whose middle name you had to double-check on the paperwork. The data, if you went looking, would back you up. Women in same-sex couples marry younger than gay men do, a few years younger on average, and the courtship tends to compress like a spring. There's a reason for it that isn't a punchline. Two people raised to a tune, to anticipate, to feel their way toward another person's emotional weather. Put them in a room together and the bonding happens at a velocity that frightens furniture stores. The early months don't feel like dating. They feel like recognition. It feels like the answer each of you has been searching for. You finish each other's anxieties. You've never been so known. You assume, reasonably, that being known this completely is the destination. What no one tells you is that being known this completely is also the beginning of a problem, because the same instinct that fused you so beautifully is the one that will, 4 years from now, mean neither of you can leave a room angry without the other one feeling it through the drywall. From the outside, the wedding looks like a victory lap. Maybe it was, depending on your family. You had the ceremony your grandmother either attended or pointedly didn't. You registered for the same KitchenAid mixer every couple registers for, the one that says we are normal people who will someday make sourdough we don't have time for. People cried at your vows and meant it. A great aunt told you she didn't understand it but supported it, which is the warmest thing some people can manage. And you took it, because you've learned to take it. And then the guests went home, and the marriage started, and the marriage was just a marriage. Bills. Whose turn it is to call the plumber? The slow discovery that the woman who knew you completely also has opinions about how the dishwasher should be loaded, and that those opinions are wrong, and that you will be litigating them for the rest of your natural life. You wanted the fairy tale, and you got a life, which is the deal everyone makes. You just had to fight a little harder for the right to be this ordinary. 2. Nobody handed you the script. Here is the strange freedom and the strange burden of two women building a home. No one ever told you who does what. In a straight marriage, there's a default. It's a bad default, an outdated one, and people resent it. But it's there. A script you can either follow or rebel against. You don't get a script. When the trash needs taking out, there is no ancient cultural assumption to make it someone's job. There is only the two of you, standing in the kitchen, both of you having been raised to be the one who notices the trash is full. So you negotiate everything, forever, from scratch. The research will tell you this works out better, and on paper it does. Female same-sex couples divide household labor more equally than anyone else. More equally than gay men. Far more equally than straight couples. You are, statistically, the most fair domestic arrangement in the country. Congratulations, Taylor and Francis online. The part the chart doesn't show is how exhausting fairness is to maintain when you can never coast on a default. Every couple has the invisible labor, the remembering, the scheduling, the knowing that the dog is due for shots. In your house, both of you are wired to carry it, which sounds like a blessing, and is occasionally a turf war over who is more tired, a competition with no trophy and no end. And the gendered ghost still gets in. Watch closely and you'll see it. The one who earns less or works fewer hours quietly drifts toward the cooking and the cleaning. The one working longer hours ends up handling the money, the repairs, the car. You swore you'd escaped all that. You married a woman partly to be free of it. And yet here you both are, Having reinvented the breadwinner and the homemaker out of pure spreadsheet logic, two feminists slowly becoming a 1950s diorama because someone has to make dinner and she got home first. Substack. You don't have roles. You have only each other and 1,000 small decisions, and the freedom to get every one of them exactly the way you want, which is its own kind of weight. Tyranny at least lets you stop deciding. 3. The merge. By the second year, you notice you've stopped being entirely sure where you end. You order for each other at restaurants. You've developed a shared face you make at parties. You text her something and she's already texting you the same thing, and you call it telepathy because the truth, that you've sanded down two separate people into one slightly blurred organism, sounds less romantic over wine. Therapists have a word for this. They call it fusion or merger, and for a long time they treated it like a diagnosis specific to women who love women, as if closeness this total were a symptom. The emotional intensity of these relationships got pathologized for decades, described as two people too dependent, too enmeshed, dissolving into each other to the detriment of both. More careful researchers have since pushed back, pointing out that the intensity isn't a disorder. It's what happens when two people, both socialized their whole lives to merge, to caretake, to feel the other person's feelings as weather in their own chest, find each other, and stop holding back. It is the most intimate thing you will ever experience. It is also, on a bad night, like being haunted by someone who's still alive and standing in the kitchen. Because here's the trap inside the gift. When you can feel everything she feels, you can't have a private feeling. Your bad mood is now a household event. Her anxiety about her mother becomes your anxiety about her mother by osmosis, transmitted through the couch. You can't be quietly disappointed. She clocks it in the set of your shoulders before you've even named it to yourself. Two emotional radar systems, always on, scanning each other, never off duty. Some couples drift apart and call it distance. You can't drift. You're sealed in. And so the quietly radical fantasy, the one you'd never say out loud, is space. When researchers actually measured this, women in same-sex couples stood out for one thing above all. They were the group most likely to wish for a little less closeness. Not less love, less fusion. The dream isn't a different wife. The dream is one afternoon where your nervous system belongs only to you. You don't say it, of course. How do you tell the person who knows you better than anyone that the knowing is sometimes a room with no door? So you take the long way to the grocery store. You sit in the parked car for 10 extra minutes pretending the podcast isn't over. You build tiny solitudes out of errands, and you call it running out for milk, and you are both, separately, doing exactly the same thing. 4. The paperwork of being a family. Then you decide to have a child, and you discover that love is not a legal document, and that America would like to see one anyway. First, there's the money, the path that lets you both touch parenthood. Reciprocal IVF, where one of you carries an embryo made from the other's egg, so you share the biology between you, is its own kind of tender, and it runs you, depending on the clinic and the year, somewhere between $15,000 and $30,000 a cycle, and the word cycle is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence, because it implies there may be more than one. $18,000 to $30,000 per attempt before anyone is pregnant. You learn to discuss five-figure sums the way other couples discuss takeout. You become fluent in a vocabulary you never wanted. Retrieval, transfer, beta levels, the 2-week wait. Romance in this season looks like a shared calendar of hormone injections and a refrigerator that has become a pharmacy. And then, mercifully, the baby comes. And then you find out you might have to adopt her. This is the part that ambushes everyone. You are legally married. Your name can go on the birth certificate, and your lawyer will still gently tell you that the birth certificate is not enough. That to make your parenthood travel safely across state lines, the non-carrying mother should formally adopt her own child. Couples call it an insurance policy. You sign the papers, submit to the questionnaire that asks whether your home has a working bathroom, and pay the state for the privilege of confirming what you already knew at 3 a.m. when you were the only one awake with her. You do it because the ground is not steady, and you know it. Marriage equality became law in 2015 by a single vote, and you have watched, in the years since, the case that protects it get formally challenged. Legislatures pass resolutions urging the court to revisit it, an entire denomination vote to seek its end. More than half of married same-sex couples in this country live in states that still have bans on the books. Defunct, unenforceable, waiting, that would snap back to life the moment the ruling fell. You don't think about it most days, then you cross a state line on the way to a funeral, and for one cold second you wonder which version of your family the local hospital recognizes. So you keep the folder, the marriage certificate, the adoption decree, the power of attorney, the second parent order. Other parents keep a baby book. You keep a baby book and a legal defense kit, because in your marriage, the love was never the question. The paperwork was. 5. The question at brunch. You learn to read the question behind the question. Are you two sisters? Is one. Who's the mom? Is another. Asked about your daughter, by a stranger who genuinely believes there can be only one. So how does that work? Usually delivered in a half-whisper, as if the mechanics of your household are a riddle they've been too polite to solve until now. You develop stock answers, light and frictionless, because the alternative is educating the entire produce aisle. And then there's the worst one, the one that comes from people who love you. Are you two still together? Asked with a little too much hope in it, a little too much readiness to be unsurprised. You've been married 6 years. No one asks your straight brother that at Thanksgiving. But your marriage, in certain relatives' minds, never fully stopped being a phase, and so every holiday is an unspoken audit. You pass the gravy and you pass the test, again, and you smile, and you file the small wound in the place where you keep all the small wounds. This is the performance no one sees. The second shift after the second shift. You are not just married, you are representing marriage, to your parents, to the coworker who voted against you and still asks about your wife to prove he's fine with it, to the world that decided your relationship was a debate it gets to keep having. You can't just have a bad year quietly. A bad year in your mind becomes evidence. Every fight carries a faint extra weight. The fear that if you fail on behalf of everyone, that someone will hear about it and nod and say, well, you know how those marriages go. So you overfunction. You keep the house a little too nice for the in-laws who came around slowly. You post the anniversary photo partly because you're happy, and partly because the photo is testimony. Your marriage was, after all, sold to the country as a story about dignity and stability. And somewhere along the way, you internalized the job of providing it. You became a flag you have to keep flying even on the days you'd rather take it down and just be tired, like anyone. Here is what they never understand at brunch. You didn't fight for the right to a perfect marriage. You fought for the right to a mediocre one. The right to be bored, to be petty, to argue about the thermostat, to be as ordinary and unimpressive as any couple who never had to prove a thing. Equality was never the freedom to be exceptional. It was the freedom to be as forgettable as everyone else. You're still waiting for the world to let you be that forgettable. 6. Who leaves? Nobody tells you that you're statistically more likely to be the one who ends it. But you are, and it's worth understanding why. Because the number gets weaponized, and the truth underneath it is more human than the number. Look at the data and a pattern is impossible to miss. In England and Wales, year after year, lesbian couples accounted for roughly 3/4 of all same-sex divorces. Far out of proportion, even to how many of you marry. In the Netherlands, 1/4 of the lesbian marriages from 1 year had dissolved within a decade, against 14% of gay men's. Across countries, the story rhymes. Female couples split more and split sooner. People love to do something ugly with this. They use it to suggest your marriages are flimsier, your love less serious. It isn't that. It's arithmetic and biography. Women initiate the overwhelming majority of all divorces, gay or straight, roughly 7 in 10. Put 2 women in a marriage, and you have, in a sense, doubled the presence of the person most willing to say this is not enough, and I am leaving. It isn't that your love fails more. It's that neither of you was raised to endure a bad marriage in silence the way some people still are. You both have the muscle for the door, and the same fusion that made the beginning so intoxicating sharpens the ending. The relationships that merge fastest have the least scaffolding when the merge wears thin. The rushed commitment, the U-Haul, the lease signed before the second names were memorized. You built a cathedral on a foundation you poured in 11 weeks, and cathedrals are heavy. So when it doesn't go quietly. It goes the way it began, completely. There's no slow heterosexual drift into separate hobbies, and a tolerable silence. There's a reckoning, because two people who feel everything cannot pretend not to feel this. You'll be the ones who name it first. You'll be the ones who can't unfeel that it's over. It is not a failure of your love that you leave. It's the cost of having loved without permission to settle. 7. Why you stay. And yet, most days, you stay. Not out of inertia, though there's some of that. The same gravity that keeps any marriage in orbit. The shared Netflix login, the mortgage with both your names, the dog who would not understand. You stay for the smaller, stranger reason that almost no one admits. You stay because no one has ever known you the way she does. And starting over means becoming a stranger to yourself again, explaining your whole interior to someone new. And you are tired. And her hand on your back in the dark still works like nothing else ever has. You stay because the fusion that suffocates you on Tuesday is the thing that saves you on Thursday. When the world out there is busy deciding whether your family should legally exist, the inside of your marriage is the one place where the question never comes up. She doesn't ask if you're really a couple. She doesn't make the brunch face. In a country that has spent your entire adult life debating you, she is the one room where you are simply, unremarkably married. That turns out to be worth an astonishing amount of dishwasher arguments. You stay because you've watched it cost something to get here. Every state in the union recognizes your marriage today, and you remember that this was true for none of your life until suddenly it was, by one vote, and could be untrue again. You've read the resolutions, watched the case get teed up for the court, seen the polling where a stubborn quarter of the country would still take it away. When you've had to keep a folder of documents proving your own family, the family itself stops feeling like something you fell into and starts feeling like something you chose, deliberately, against friction, on purpose, more than once. Hard to walk away from a thing you had to fight that hard to build. So you fold the laundry, you divide the labor you have to renegotiate forever. You make space out of grocery runs. You feel her bad mood through the wall, and you go to her anyway. You sit across from the relative who still hopes this is temporary, and you outlast them, year after year, by the simple radical act of still being there. This is the part the wedding photos couldn't show you, that the love was never going to be the hard part. The hard part was carrying it through a world that kept asking you to justify it, with no script, no default, no one to tell you who does what. Just two women, attuned to the marrow, building an ordinary life in a place that won't quite let it be ordinary. You wanted the fairy tale. What you got was a marriage, which, it turns out, was the braver thing to want all along. In the end, you didn't fight all those years for something extraordinary. You fought for the right to be as bored, as tired, and as quietly, stubbornly in love as anybody else. And then you went home and lived it, one renegotiated trash day at a time.